second panel, which is about how to talk about climate change. My name is Gabi Kay. I'm the co-founder of Invincible Unicorn, which is an ethical creative communications company in B Corp. Green the Bid, which is a grassroots advertising initiative working to green commercial production, and Gigantic Fucking Solutions, which is a grassroots initiative tackling the communication of the climate crisis amongst the advertising industry, which is exactly why we're here today. So what we're going to be talking about today is how social media can play an active and positive role in informing and educating and inspiring people to take action on the climate crisis. And I'm very excited to welcome our panelists today. We have Molly Kawahata, who is former policy advisor for energy and climate from the Obama White House. We have Kane, senior digital direct marketing and communications at Lonely Whale, and Cyrill Gutsch, founder and CEO of Parley for the Oceans, and Jasmine Solano, who is climate action advocate and co-founder of the Clubhouse Global. So I wanted to start by introducing you all and giving you an opportunity just to introduce yourselves with a little bit more information. So Molly, just very quickly, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Molly Kawahata. I'm a former climate and energy advisor at the Obama White House, where we work to implement President Obama's energy agenda and climate action plan. I currently work on clean energy in the tech sector in California. I've done clean energy work and climate communication in politics, government, advocacy, and consulting. And I'm really happy to be here to talk with you all about strategic communications and climate.
Thanks, Molly. And Emmy, how about you?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Kane. I'm with Lonely Whale. My background really stems in the startup space around using tech to bring people together and build communities. And so I'm doing the same thing now with Lonely Whale and bringing new audiences together and helping facilitate conversations around climate and the oceans and what everyone can do about that.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Cyrill, please.
Hey, hi. My name is Cyrill. I'm the founder of CEO of Parley for the Oceans. And yeah, I stopped being a design firm, and my partner and I started Parley 8 years ago because we realized that if we don't turn things around, if we don't turn actually materials around that we're using to make things and stop killing everything that we see out there in nature, then we won't have a future on this planet. And I'm happy to be here and speak about communication.
Thank you so much. And Jasmine.
Yes, hi. I am a DJ, host, and curator, and most recently co-founder and executive producer of the social impact initiative and live stream platform Clubhouse Global. And I always seem to sit at the intersection of music and activism, and that absolutely includes climate action. And I'm excited to dive into more about how we can marry all those concepts with the music community today.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jasmine. So to kick off the conversation, I wanted to talk about how at the moment, there is a politically instigated polarization around climate change, and it's a major issue today. And social media has played a central role in heightening that. It also carries the potential to be a really powerful mediating tool. So it has two characteristics that are very instrumental in influencing attitudes. One is that it's very creative and expressive, but the second is also that it is consumptive. So Jasmine, I really wanted to start with you. How do you see social media as a driving force for both good and bad in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, so let's start with the good. I think that we've seen a lot of cultural and political movements gain rapid speed over social media, especially within the last several years. I think that when it becomes either trendy, however you want to see that, as good or bad, or normal to be active and have a stance on a certain issue, even if that's through social media, we begin to see a cultural shift. Now, the flip side to that is when trends take off on social media or people think they should be posting about a certain topic, they tend to not either know all the details about why they're posting it. They may just be doing it to save face, and there may be a lack of facts and information behind how they can deepen their quote unquote stance.
And Molly, in kicking off the conversation with you about the climate communications to date, one of the breakdowns that we've seen is that we've tended to frame the narrative so far as something that's happening 100 years in the future or 1,000 miles away. And that distancing has led people to think that this is a far-off thing. Mm-hmm. Your work centers around communicating the immediate health impacts of the environmental crisis. Could you talk more about where we could be focusing this message?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important thing for us to think about is where do we start? How can we be strategic from the beginning about how we're talking about climate change and climate communications? So I'll start with a study that was done in the 80s. And in this study, the researchers instructed the subjects to not think of a white bear. And when they heard this, what do you think they thought about? Thought about a white bear. This is because thought suppression is something that's extremely difficult in the human brain. So we need to do what's called reframing. And a lot of this is based on George Lakoff's work. He's a prominent cognitive linguist at UC Berkeley. So let me explain what that means. So it's very hard to negate a frame without strengthening that existing frame. So there's a common attack on the climate movement that says climate action hurts the economy. This is a hard thing to attack, right? So if somebody's yelling that, it's not effective for me to go stand next to them and yell, no, climate action does not hurt the economy, because I'm telling everybody not to think of a white bear. I'm still advancing the association between climate action and a hurt economy. So what we should do is reframing. Now, if I wanted to stay in the economic domain, and this exists on social media, if I wanted to stay in that domain, I could say something like, climate change represents the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. And that's what we did at the Obama White House. That was the frame we used. President Obama said that a lot. But I even want to take a step back further to think about where do we start from square zero to be effective? At the Obama White House, we went on a journey to discover how can we reach the minds of the American public? How can we meet them where they are? Because we knew that to make systemic change, to take big climate action through policy, we need the American people on board. So we tested all of these frames extensively, and there are so many because climate change obviously impacts every sector of society and every aspect of American life. So we tested them all. So there's climate change as a national security issue. This is things like climate change puts us in danger, disaster response. It's distant, it's not that effective in the minds of the average American person. There's climate change as an economic issue, which is for every decade we don't act on climate, it's going to cost us this much more. Not that effective. There's climate change as an environmental issue, and this has been the predominating narrative for decades. This is polar bears in the Arctic, melting glaciers. This is not effective because a mom who's working 2 jobs in the US doesn't have the luxury of thinking about or being concerned with things that are happening thousands of miles away, like you say. So it's just not that effective with the average person. By far, unequivocally, the most effective way for us to talk about climate change is through the lens of public health. And this is how climate change becomes climate justice. When we talk about it through this lens, we're integrating communities of color that have not had a seat at the table when they're talking about the environmental movement, when we're talking about climate change more broadly. But 1 in 10 Black children in America has asthma. 10% of Black children in America have asthma. And that's because communities of color are significantly likelier to have to live near things like polluting power plants, polluting highways, toxic waste sites. This is amazing work that the NAACP has done. And every time I cite that figure, I get fact checked. People don't believe me. But who it's not a shock to is the communities of color, the original climate activists that have been fighting for clean air and clean water for their children for decades, long before climate change was even a term. So if somebody's yelling, climate action hurts the economy, I'm going to take that and I'm going to reframe it into something like, in the public health realm, like join us in fighting climate change for the health and safety of our children. Now, that might not sound like I'm saying much, but the reason it is effective is if we break down the frame. So climate action hurts the economy includes concepts of compromise, sacrifice, and balance. How much of the economy are we willing to sacrifice for climate action? When we integrate it and talk about the health and safety of our children, there is no component of sacrifice. We do not sacrifice the health and safety of our children. We do not balance it. We do not compromise on that. And that's because climate action is it's a non-starter for us to consider not fighting for climate action. It's in our best interest economically, and it's vital for us through a public health lens. So that's really how we need to be talking about this, is through the lens of public health in a way that's intersectional.
That makes a great deal of sense. And I look at that in the context of how that impacts people at a very personal level rather than it being a much broader and distant idea. Obviously, that requires us to be more culturally aware. Jasmine, you're a real driver of culture. How have you used your social presence to rally people to better understand the impacts of climate change? And when you're promoting and educating people within your community on climate change, do you find that emotional or factual communications land more effectively?
Right. So I feel responsible for the people that don't care about climate change, have never heard the term climate action, but instead they love music. And so I try to find a way to make climate action and the conversation digestible, relatable, cool, fun, sexy, whatever I have to do to get the door open. And, you know, something that I launched last year was a series on my IGTV called Sustainability Sundays. And I filmed 12 episodes ranging from how to compost your food, how to prepare for a natural disaster, what's actually happening in the Amazon. And I try to make these little videos in order to bring people into the conversation in a way that maybe, you know, is fun for them or that they can relate to. In addition, there's an organization that I really want to shout out today called DJs for Climate Action. And that was founded in 2011 by Fool's Gold producer Sammy Bananas. And they cultivate partnerships with advocacy groups and climate conscious projects. They run campaigns, they put out music. And that's another way to kind of intersect all of this. But I find that, again, like if there's like two ways in which opening that door becomes possible on a larger scale. One, at least, and we're talking about the United States, if a lot of celebrities are talking about one issue, which Lonely Whale has done a great job at doing. I'm sure Emmy will talk about that, but also when there's a grassroots movement that takes over, such as the Black Lives Matter movement and the uprising that's been happening over the past 6 months. We've seen that popular opinion can absolutely shift when enough micro communities are pushing for these issues and talking about these issues. So that's where I found a lot of luck. But, you know, and in terms of factual versus emotional, I think that Molly just broke it down. When you break down the factual, it should produce an emotional effect. I think that is the winning formula. And you just have to find the facts that relate to that specific person more so than that it being this, you know, this distanced, too big to handle concept that most people don't feel connected to.
I think that's a really vital point, that it actually requires a creative response. I mean, with the group that we have talking right here today, and obviously we are talking about climate communications, but 3 of you come from a very specifically creative response to communicating about the climate crisis. And I think people are more and more willing to listen to those communications where they come from a more creative background. I wanted to talk to you, Cyrill, a bit more about that creative response yourself. In another interview that I heard you speak about, you mentioned that creatives need a deadline and that has an impact on how they produce work. And I thought it was really interesting because the climate crisis is actually all deadlines. Like, we have these deadlines coming up and we're blowing through them. So being responsive to those is really important. When it comes to climate communications, how do we go and inspire people to take action around those same deadlines, climate deadlines, with the same enthusiasm that designers bring to a problem?
Yeah, hi. I think, first of all, a deadline is, for me, something very liberating, because I know there is a moment where I either fail or I succeeded. And that creates pressure, and that allows me to step out of my comfort zone and also forget a little bit all my everyday situations. And I think that's what this cause does to me. When I learned 8 years ago that the oceans would die pretty much in our lifetime, and I realized that pretty much it's all based, all these environmental issues are based on economic failure. And then you can root it back to design and science and technology and all the materials we use. I felt like, whoa, this is the ultimate creative challenge, you know? And why wouldn't we not approach that the same way we would normally design something, where we would know there is something in place and people don't want to change it often. They're scared because change is pain. And you have to convince them, you have to seduce them really. And you have to show that, and you can't do that with blame and shame. You can't do it by talking down the old. You have to more or less accept the old, accept the problems, and then say, okay, but let's leave that behind us. And go and inspire people and encourage them, and don't be egomaniac about it. Just like open up and say, hey, here's an idea. I'm going for that. And if you like, you can observe me. And oh, wow, suddenly there's a group of people around us and they're doing the same. And join us or do your own thing. That's how we are approaching this topic. And I feel that these numbers that are being thrown around, like 2030, 2048 back then when we started, that means like, oh, there is this like fictional deadline somewhere in the near future. We have to really try to take them very serious and say, and everybody should do that for themselves and should just accept a certain timeline and say, what can I do in the next 10 years? What can I achieve in these like 10 times 1 years? And how can I encourage my network to do the same? And how can we come up with a strategy? And I think there is where we at Parley started back then. We said we need a strategy. Otherwise, we're just running around like chickens. And that's nothing against chickens. I love chickens. I don't even eat them. But the point is, 10 years is not a lot of time. And we are already in the 6th mass extinction event. And we have to change a lot of these standard technologies and standard materials that we're using today. We pretty much have to change everything business is based on. And you can only do that with a plan. And you can only do that with a strategy. And you can only do it with collaboration and with a lot of inspiration and motivation. I think that was the point we wanted to make with Parley, was there is an idea of like purpose could be the new luxury. People could actually prefer things that make sense over things that don't make sense, items they buy, things they vote for with their wallet. And why wouldn't we not take some companies, some countries, and also individuals and help them to become champions in that and live by example? And we've done that with a certain amount of brands, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and now even banks. And the truth is that the moment you do something and you just create and you focus on the positive, you're going to create a beautiful outcome. And everybody who's in that journey will learn from that and will feel like inspired by it. And then others more or less copy that or they join, and that's beautiful. And you speak about it on, of course, all channels, but it's not about speaking about it per se. It's about making other people witness through what you're going. And also, honestly, show them how rewarding it is to stand up and do something, even if it's a small little step.
I completely agree. And funnily enough, that's very similar to what Emmy's campaign for Stop Sucking was able to do, by appealing to people to come together as a community and using humor as a way instead of, there are lots of ways they're already effective, but we don't have to shame people. Humor is a great way of reaching people with these kind of communications. So I wanted to talk to you, Emmy, a little bit about Stop Sucking. It was a massive viral social media success, reached over 350 million viewers across 40 countries, which is astounding. And it did that with the objective of reducing the number of straws in circulation and also permanently maintaining that reduction. Obviously, social media has changed an enormous amount just in that short time since that campaign was. How do you think, with the changes that have occurred in social media, you might have handled that campaign differently, and how, when you're doing the work with Lonely Whale, you look at using social media now?
Mm-hmm. Great question and awesome segue, Cyrill. So thanks for setting me up so nicely with that. I think, you hit it spot on. It's how do you make this really interesting, exciting, and accessible to the everyday person? It's not about being should upon, as my CEO June always likes to say. It's about really asking people to join you in this movement and whatever way that might look like. So for us, the straw was really the way in. Essentially, it was kind of, the white, not thinking about the white bear, but in this context, climate change through the lens of plastics. And so really bringing people along on this journey of understanding that, yes, it is a big problem, plastic pollution. And yes, there are these big dates like 2050 and 2030, but that, every single day you can be part of a successful movement by saying no to something like a plastic straw or whatever else that might be within your own lifestyle, but really sparking that conversation. I think today in social media, which obviously moves at, light speed, things have changed a lot. The general consumer and voter is really aware of the issues of plastic pollution and of all the intersectional issues as well too. So I think now, especially folks within the plastic and ocean space, coming at this issue from one of a lens of intersection is really critical in moving folks forward. and really meeting them where they are too.
And I had a question for everybody again about what the social media landscape looks like now. I mean, obviously, Emmy has a very strong relationship to that with the work that she specifically does. But bearing in mind, we now have universal agreement amongst scientists that climate change is real, and the public are definitely aware, but we don't have consistent communication from governments or the private sector about what an effective response to the environmental breakdown would look like. How do you think we could open up social media as a way of creating strong, clear narratives about climate action? And that's a question for anybody who'd like to answer it. Molly, would you like to answer it?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's really important. So the number one question I get in my work is, what can I do? People think, I read the articles, I'm nervous, I'm scared, I want to know how I can help. And I think that's wonderful. There's so many more people entering our movement. We want everybody on board. I caution us from overstating the impacts of this idea of kind of like greening your life when it comes to climate action. I kind of put that into the category of sustainable living in a more sustainable way. When we think about the climate crisis, this is a problem at scale that requires systemic solutions. We need systemic change here. And when I talk about that, I'm really talking about government action. So one example is, for example, if you need to go buy a car, the burden can be on you as a consumer to purchase a car that's more efficient, or we can work to elect climate forward candidates who go into office, work with auto manufacturers to institute what we call fuel efficiency standards, which are policies that say a car needs to go this much further on a gallon of gas by this year. And they're progressive policies. So the more that technology advances, the more all cars that are manufactured, the more efficient they are. So that me as a consumer, whatever my budget is, when I go to purchase a car, it's going to be one that's more efficient. We need to be thinking about it in terms of systems. And so I think systemic change is really important. Now, what I see play out on social media that concerns me a lot as well over kind of greening your life is this idea of what Emma Maris in the New York Times considered pitting eco-saints against eco-sinners. And there's a lot of privilege associated with being able to make a lot of these individual actions in your life. It requires a lot of time, energy, and resources to be able to make those changes, like biking to work. A lot of communities don't have bike lanes in their community. Going vegetarian, a lot of communities don't have grocery stores in their community. These are food deserts where they don't have access to fresh and healthy food. A lot of these things are hard, right? And so to be able to do that, even if there's like a mass influx of people that were to, for example, cut their carbon footprint in half, which would require you to give up your car, never get on a plane again, only buy local food, only buy local goods that are manufactured, maybe shut off your heat and power during certain hours of the night. To cut your carbon footprint in half, that's really hard. Now, say you got everybody in California based on that national average, and this is just an illustrative example, to do the same thing, you would think that would make a huge impact. But unfortunately, it wouldn't even impact 0.1% or 0.01% of carbon emissions internationally, globally. So we need to think about systems because, one, that's how we can impact and integrate everybody into the conversation, including communities of color that have traditionally not been a part of it. And that's how we can influence change at scale. That's how we fight climate change. So I think these are two different categories and we cannot confuse the two.
Absolutely. And I also think, Cyrill, in the context of working with those systems, the corporate system is a very big part of that. You talk about changing car manufacturers' behavior. Cyrill, you've worked with major organizations such as the World Bank and the United Nations and even international governments to create impact. So how have you used media to create call to actions to individuals through those kinds of organizations?
First of all, it's funny that we're actually working with governments now, because we started out saying that there is no way that governments will solve these problems because they are pretty much like always in the pocket of industry. And also my background is industry. I know companies inside out. I know why they're not changing. I know when they're changing. I know how to get them to change, because that was my job as a designer, as a strategist before I started Parley. So I know exactly why people avoid change. And the truth is that right now, the spearhead, the fast move has to come from the private sector. And it's right, it's unfair to put the burden on the consumer. But the truth is, though, if you're hitting a certain amount of consumers and you get them to speak out or to get them to prefer certain products or solutions or brands or ideas, the industry will wake up to that. And we have proven that with our partnerships. And then suddenly we saw that products that were made in a different way would outperform others. And then the brands wake up and the companies wake up, and then they see a cultural shift in their organization. They see more innovation power. They see actually that their people are more happy to go to work. And they say, oh, actually, finally, my company is standing up for something. We believe that turning some brands into champions and turning them around completely is very successful, because it will be copied by others. And then the governments can use it to kind of more or less put pressure from their side towards the industry and say, oh, if they are doing it, why are you not doing this? And I think we hit this point last year in September when World Bank invited us to their annual meeting, and they said, oh, you created an end-to-end solution for marine plastic pollution with our strategy AIR, avoid, intercept, and redesign, which says avoid plastic where possible, intercept trash. If you can't avoid it, use intercepted material. And then the R is redesign plastic. Let plastic go, because it's technically a design failure. It's toxic. It shouldn't be around. And they said, we can actually help to scale that. And we also observed you in these countries. And for example, in Maldives or Sri Lanka, where Parley had been, through collaboration, very efficient and got the heart of the locals and worked very closely with local communities. And suddenly we would turn $1 into 1,000, while a World Bank or United Nations or all these big funds, they have problems to be efficient with their spending. So what we learned is, if you keep talking to key persons in different organizations and you deliver them proof of concepts, and they feel like, okay, now it's safe to actually present it themselves to others, they will support you. But you have to start somewhere. And we started grassroots. We started by really convincing some consumers and getting them heard.
That's, I mean, what you've done with Parley is extraordinary, and to have that kind of insight into how you created that is so valuable. I wanted to shift tack a little bit and talk about media, that social media that doesn't get talked about quite so much, even though it's enormously influential now, which is podcasts, which is such an opportunity to work in a long form space and get more information over to an audience. Emmy, with Lonely Whale, your host, Patrice Jones, who's part of Lonely Whale as well, recently brought us this amazing podcast, 52 Hertz, which is inspired by the whale who dared to call out his own frequency, which is so lovely. You can listen to it on the podcast. Against the Current, season 1 is currently live. How do you foresee this new longer form of social media, podcast, connecting with your audience and better understanding the climate issues that now face our Earth?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's interesting right now, especially as we take a step back and we kind of look at the landscape right now, particularly in the face of this election, and even understand how consumers are interacting with social media. There is a recent poll done by Pew that said 55% of Americans are kind of already tapped out of the social posts around the election. And we're seeing rising rates of daily unpluggers, as they're called, which are opting out of their digital lives, essentially. And so when you think about something like podcast, which is a very intimate, it's a solitary, but yes, it's a two-way exchange that you're having with the host and with the guests as well. It provides a really great opportunity to not only go deeper with the issues around climate change and have those more nuanced conversations, so you can explore systemic issues and solutions for those problems, as you mentioned, Molly, and to really kind of build that out. Another thing that I think is really interesting in terms of a trend on social media that's a little bit different, that also kind of follows a similar track to audio, is around texting. And that too is also really particular to the campaign right now. And we're seeing an incredible rise in the number of texts. I'm sure everyone who's watching this right now has gotten a text, whether it's from a local candidate or from one of the national candidates as well too. And so I think it's interesting to see things like text message, things like audio, really coming back into the forefront as we think about more personalized approach with our communities, and how that then brings us closer to climate solutions.
Yeah, I think that personalized approach is increasingly vital. People expect it. I wanted to ask you, Jasmine, when you're talking to someone who doesn't know a great deal about the subject of the climate crisis, where do you find that personal common ground that motivates them to care? And what are common areas where you find people have incorrect assumptions about these issues?
Yeah, so I kind of take the music lovers and I use my platform in order to bring them over to other organizations that I'm affiliated with. So, for example, the Slow Factory, which is an incredible educational organization that fights for human rights and climate justice. They have an annual study hall at the New York Times building. And in January, I was able to host that and DJ the after party. And they're really committed to climate action through the fashion industry and having the fashion industry be responsible for their footprint, which is a whole nother panel and conversation. But anyone who is following me for music reasons is now exposed to the Slow Factory. I also participated in the Stop Sucking campaign several years ago with Lonely Whale. I DJ'd one of their fundraising events. I did a mix for them. And again, we're cross-pollinating audiences. And I at least just try to use whatever small platform I have to bring awareness to everyone else who's really doing the work. And I find that, again, breaking it down. So for example, if I were to say to someone, the salmon and the sea bass that you just bought from Whole Foods has this percentage, it probably has this percentage of microplastics in it. Just letting you know, I think it's breaking it down to everyone's everyday choices. And then, I loved that both Molly and Cyrill were saying that it's not fair to put all of that heavy weight on the consumer. However, educating the consumer and also letting them know what is how they are affected in all these minute ways every single day allows you to have an emotional shift. And then you'll put pressure on Congress, Congress people and local advocates and policymakers in order to achieve the goals. So I appreciate just that we're all at these various layers trying to get the job done.
I think that's such an amazing point, Jasmine, because it's essentially what I was going to ask Molly next, which is that when people talk about these different areas of accountability for the climate crisis, they all actually come back to the same area, which is that if you empower people, then people put the pressure on government, and government can legislate, which is how government was supposedly designed. So I wanted to ask Molly, as a question, as an expert on climate messaging, where do you stand on the argument of government versus personal behavior? And in the same way, what resources would you recommend for people who want to rise to that challenge, like Jasmine said, of getting politically involved?
Yeah, Jasmine, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's such a good point about consumers need to understand the systems they're living in. Right. And that's not their fault that we've been given the system. It's not your fault that if you plug your phone in at night, you're using dirty energy. You didn't ask for that. You're not trying to pollute. You're just living in the system. And so the more we can educate individuals on understanding what's happening, the more we can do individual action, which turns into collective action, which turns into systems and changes at scale. And that's the premise of democracy. And that's what we're seeing play out in the next 2 weeks, right? With this election coming up, is individuals working collectively to elect climate candidates who can institute change. And so kind of in these examples I'm giving, so say you make a lot of kind of greening of your life, individual changes in your life. I think that's great. And for anybody that has the time, the resources, and the energy to be able to do those things, I think it's wonderful. And we should all keep doing them. Living in a sustainable way is really important. But when I think about solutions at scale, if you think about, for example, making these really drastic changes in your life, for example, if you wanted to cut your carbon footprint in half, which I mentioned is shockingly difficult. Say that you do those things and you've made life pretty difficult for yourself. Say across town, there's a fossil fuel power plant, right? And it's spewing pollution into the air, and the community around it is forced to breathe that air. And their children are suffering from inordinately high asthma rates, which I mentioned earlier. We have to ask ourselves, when we think about climate as a social issue, when we make those individual changes, what are we doing to stand with them in that fight? Right? Like, how are we using our platforms, our work, our privilege in order to help clean up the air for these communities? This is, I think, where we need to be thinking of our efforts systemically. That's why I think we really need to come together. And on social media, the other thing I just really want to call out is, again, this idea of eco saints versus eco sinners. I have seen so many people call out people who are trying to join the climate movement, who are part of it, activists, because they don't meet their standards of perfection of how somebody should be living their life. And why this is really concerning is because it does take a lot of time, energy, and resources to make sustainable changes in your life that not everybody has access to. So when we think about that, I kind of think about it sometimes as like, you know, people sitting on their perch of privilege, hissing at everybody below for not taking the same actions they are when everybody below is doing the best they can. And this is why it's so important, because what we're doing is we're taking people who are joining the climate movement, who are part of it, and we're kicking them out. We're kicking out people who like want to be a part of what we're doing. And it's the same way we see this kind of in cancel culture, this idea of kind of equating like willful anti-climate action with people who aren't meeting standards of perfection. And I think that's really destructive and non-productive to our movement. So it's just something I think we should be thinking about more broadly. There are ways that we can take action on climate that integrate everybody and work to help everybody. And so just kind of where we're focusing our efforts, that really determines kind of what path we're taking there.
I think that's such a wonderful point to conclude these questions on, because I think this should be a broad conversation. It should be welcome to everybody. We're all in this boat together as far as this is our planet. This is what we've got. So we're going to have to do something with it. So that removal of the shame, and we all start here and we cause what we cause, makes an enormous difference. Thank you, Molly. So I have some questions from the audience now, which I'm going to open to the floor. If you want to answer it, just step right in there. So I have a question here from James, and it is it worth spending time trying to convince the climate deniers, or should we focus more effort on those who acknowledge it but don't know where to start being part of the solution?
I think both is fine. It's just a question of which battle you want to take on. I personally like to speak to people that are already willing to do something, or they are not at least denying it. They're just open for it. But I think there's nothing bad in going for people that are really stubborn and confronting them with the realities that is actually facing us very soon.
I completely agree. Does anyone else have a position on that too?
So I completely understand. I believe that we should be talking to folks and expanding that conversation based on strategic messaging and the research we have behind psychology. I do caution people from engaging too far with climate deniers for a couple of reasons. One, there's been like a false equivalency that's been created in our media and our narrative that these are equal, right? Like you're a climate denier or you're like pro-climate, and where are you? And we see this play out in Congress, right? There's a huge overrepresentation of climate deniers compared to the American public. 90% of Americans want action on climate change. 99% of scientists say that climate change is anthropomorphic. It's human caused, right? So it's a very, very, very tiny minority that's very loud. And so I think we need to be careful about not over engaging them in saying that there's a white bear. The more we try to prove that climate change is real, the more we're saying, don't think of a white bear, that climate change might not be real. Even though we're negating it, it's a negligible difference when you think about the neural network in somebody's brain. So I think it's just important we think about that. And there's so much work we have to engage who's already a part of this movement and how we can activate them. And there's so many ways to activate them. And I just believe in opportunity cost too, that time spent focusing on one group is time not spent focusing on another. And so we just need to be conscious of that.
I completely understand. It actually brings us to our next question, which is from Stephanie, which is, in your opinion, what have you seen successfully shift, not just people's views, but also their actions to save the environment? What about you, Emmy? Because you've actually had people shift their behaviors in that way.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I guess I'd love to kind of bring it back to the conversation we were having around system change and the importance of change at scale to really drive these solutions. And so one thing that has been really interesting to us, so at Lonely Whale, much like the work that Parley is doing, we're bringing together global multinational brands to really sit at the table together and try to figure out how they can not only reduce non-essential plastics in their businesses, but also to create what is the first of its kind global supply chain network. And so it's fascinating. You have, different companies, many of whom are competitors with each other. So HP and Dell and Human Scale and Herman Miller and other brands like this that are really hearing not only, their consumers that are asking for this change, which is, important. And it is, yes, a part of that greening your lifestyle, but it's also in a way helping to push this conversation forward, especially to the C-suite that then is able to make these decisions on a global scale. So I think it's pretty fascinating. And again, I think it goes back to inviting someone in. So it's not driving kind of a line down the middle and saying you're on this side and you're on that side and you can't play unless you're perfect. It's more, how do we try to solve this creatively? What can we do now so that we can get to where we need to go? And we know the clock is ticking, so let's get going. So I think, again, it is that invitation in that is so important.
Yeah. My next question is from Jason, and it is, with all your experience in collaboration in these sectors, so in the corporate sector, the governmental sector, and then direct to people, what lessons can we learn to achieve powerful and effective partnerships? Powerful and effective partnerships between all of them. What do you think, Jasmine, with your work with people and organizations?
Yeah, I was going to say, and I don't know if this answers this question specifically, but, Al Gore's two films, An Inconvenient Truth and An Inconvenient Sequel, Leonardo DiCaprio's documentaries, I think that, the use of art, be it music, film, visual art, I think is so powerful. Look at the show Planet Earth and how many impressions and tweets and or maybe it's been talked about on podcasts as well. Like that show alone, just by showing the beauty of nature, but also throwing in, what is in danger, I think hits a lot of nerves with people emotionally. And, it's very clear from what Molly is saying that we have to attack this on a systemic level. But I think that the use of arts is going to be really key in getting mass amounts of people and consumers to feel the urge and motivation to speak out about this publicly. And obviously what Cyrill was saying with collaboration has to happen on all fronts. And I think that's one of our biggest lessons we've learned in this pandemic is that we can't survive, without collaboration. It's part of our human DNA. And whether that is using your own platform, whether that is doing more information on an educational level. I know that even Al Gore has his program Climate Reality, where I've been trying to go and get my climate certificate, which anyone can go and do. And you just sign up for a weekend conference and you get educated just on the basics. And then you're encouraged to go back into your community and state the facts and help where you can. Obviously, the pandemic has stopped all of those gatherings from happening, but there's a lot of ways that you can get involved on the ground level, and there's a lot of ways that we can collaborate with the arts.
I am all in for creative solutions to inescapable problems. Final question from Savannah. So he says, sometimes it feels like the Instagram algorithm makes my climate change posts go to the same people over and over again rather than to new people. Are there alternatives when social media only goes so far? So, gosh, this could be a question for any one of you. Who fancies jumping into that one?
I think it's over. I think Instagram is the past, to be honest. I mean, it's over commercialized. Nobody understands anymore what these algorithms are doing. I think they don't understand themselves anymore. And I'm sure if you would study the algorithm, you would have crazy success by posting very silly pictures because they fit exactly into these analytics. My personal feeling is it's time for a new social network.
There's a lot of agreement there.
Yeah, definitely. I think things have changed so much, and I think you're right, Cyrill. Like, there's definitely going to be, a look for a new social network, and I think we've already seen it with the rise of TikTok. That does have a very different type of algorithm, and a different chance for discoverability, and a different chance for being vulnerable, and maybe not as polished as you see on Instagram. And I guess too, to answer your question as well, like, how do you go deeper? How do you find new folks? I think that also speaks to the power of collaboration and why it's so important for organizations and cultural influencers and policy and everything to come together and really be able to cross-pollinate on those pages so that we can create a much more diverse ecosystem than, again, yes, like your same 3 folks that are maybe saying the same thing and don't provide you that multifaceted approach that you really need to be able to tackle the climate crisis in your own life or in your own community.
I mean, I love that you bring that up too, about how we can meet people where they are and what other forums there are available to reach new folks and reach new audiences. I think there are also opportunities for things to come offline, right? So if we're actually thinking about like climate change again, when we think about what it looks like on the ground, that can be things like registering people to vote, making calls for climate forward candidates, making sure you vote, making sure your friends and family vote. All of those things can also play a role in us figuring out how do we reach more people. And we can also do that through political campaigns and elections.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I think what that's left us with is an awareness that there are communications to be made. There's multiple platforms to do it on, or if you're in the process of building a platform, build that platform that we need, social media, to be able to reach everyone and not have algorithms that send us down little dark holes. So thank you all so much for joining me today, and thank you again for listening.
What's up, guys? Boye from The Future Party and from the future, clearly. Thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, and click the bell for more notifications. Check out the description for more on us. We've got some amazing things for you coming down the pipeline. Peace.